The final 24 hours of America's most twisted clown, John Wayne Gacy. Hi, everyone. He was one of the most feared serial predators in American history. A man who hid behind grease paint and a grin, performing as a clown at children's parties while secretly committing unspeakable crimes. John Wayne Gacy, dubbed the Killer Clown, lured, tortured, and took the lives of at least 33 young men and boys, burying many beneath his suburban home. But what happens when a monster like this faces the end of his own story on May 9th, 1994, after 14 years on death row? Gacy awoke for the last time, knowing the clock was ticking. What were his final thoughts? Did he feel remorse? And how did the state of Illinois handle the final moments of a man whose crimes still haunt the nation today? We're walking you through the haunting final 24 hours of John Wayne Gacy, a countdown filled with eerie calm, defiant words, and one disturbing final twist. Stay with us. Dear friends, the sun had barely risen on May 9th, 1994, when John Wayne Gacy opened his eyes for the last time. For most, a Monday morning would begin with routine. But for Gacy, the man known to America as the Killer Clown, this day would be anything but ordinary. He lay in his cell at Stateville Correctional Center, having spent over a decade in solitary confinement. His every move monitored, his every word documented. Yet as his execution day arrived, Gacy showed no outward sign of anxiety or remorse. Instead, he moved through the motions with an unsettling calm, just as he had in the courtroom, just as he had when denying his role in one of the darkest crime sprees in American history. The man who once painted cheerful clowns and handed out balloons to children had been convicted in 1980 for the horrifying torture and killing of 33 young men and boys. Most of his victims were found buried beneath the crawlspace of his suburban Chicago home, their lives violently ended by a predator who wore a mask of normalcy. Gacy's death sentence had been debated for years, with appeals, denials, and public scrutiny building toward this final moment. And now, the time had come. Breakfast was served at dawn: eggs, toast, and coffee. Despite the weight of the day ahead, Gacy reportedly showed no distress. He ate in silence, displaying the same chilling composure that had unnerved investigators and journalists for years. Prison officials and guards observed closely, ensuring no harm came to him before his execution, ironically protecting the man who had destroyed so many lives. Around mid-morning, visitors began to arrive. Most of Gacy's family had long severed ties, unable to reconcile with the horrors he had committed. But one person remained: his younger sister, Karen Kuzma. Despite everything, Karen stood by him in his final hours, driven by a bond forged long before the world knew John Wayne Gacy as a killer. A photo from that morning would later capture them together, hugging and smiling, an image that disturbed many, given the context. But for Karen, it was a goodbye to her brother, not the monster the world knew, but the boy she had grown up with. Legal representatives and spiritual advisors also arrived, continuing their 11th-hour efforts to appeal the sentence. Gacy, who had converted to Catholicism during his time in prison, requested last rites. A priest arrived by early afternoon to administer the sacrament, a solemn ritual traditionally performed for those nearing death. It was a rare moment of quiet reflection in a life marred by darkness. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, crowds had begun to gather. Some held candles, protesting the death penalty. Others cheered, calling for justice. Media vans lined the perimeter. The atmosphere was thick with tension. At the center of it all was a man who remained disturbingly unaffected, detached from the frenzy unfolding both inside and out. At 500 people, preparations began. Gacy was moved from his regular cell to the execution holding cell, just steps from the chamber where his life would end. Security around him intensified. This was standard procedure, but with a man like Gacy infamous, unrepentant, and manipulative, no precautions were considered excessive. Later that evening, Gacy received his final meal: a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. It was a meal that drew public interest, not only for its content, but for its disturbing symbolism. Before his arrest, Gacy had managed 3 KFC restaurants. To many, the choice was a cruel reminder of the life he had led in public, respectable, hard-working, even generous, while secretly harboring a monstrous double life. After eating, Gacy showered, changed into a clean prison uniform, and spent his remaining hours speaking with his spiritual advisor. He declined a final phone call and made no attempt to reach out to victims' families. There was no sign of remorse, no reflection on his crimes, only more denials and claims of innocence. Even in his final hours, Gacy clung to the delusion that he had been wronged, that the system had failed him, not the other way around. At approximately 11:30 p.m., the final march began. Flanked by guards and accompanied by a chaplain, Gacy was escorted to the execution chamber. Though the walk was short, the weight of the moment was immense. Behind a glass window stood a group of witnesses, journalists, law enforcement officers, and several relatives of the victims. They had waited years, some over a decade, for this moment. Strapped to the gurney, Gacy remained expressionless. When offered the chance to speak his final words, he looked toward the witnesses and, in a voice full of defiance, sneered, "Kiss my ass." That was it. No apology, no hint of sorrow, just a last cruel act of rebellion from a man who had made a career out of manipulation and psychological terror. At 12:01 a.m., on May 10th, the lethal injection procedure began. A 3-drug cocktail flowed into his veins, an anesthetic to render him unconscious, a paralytic to stop his breathing, and finally, potassium chloride to stop his heart. But the execution did not go as planned. The IV line became clogged, causing an 18-minute delay. Gacy lay motionless as technicians worked to fix the problem, a moment that drew criticism and discomfort from those present. In a grim irony, the man who had inflicted unspeakable pain on so many now suffered a prolonged end himself. John Wayne Gacy was officially pronounced dead. His body was taken for autopsy, where forensic scientists examined his brain in search of abnormalities that might explain his behavior. They found none. No signs of tumors, no malformations, nothing that could justify or explain the horror he had inflicted. His remains were cremated days later. There was no public funeral, no grave. His ashes were returned to family, with no official resting place ever disclosed. Unlike other infamous figures whose graves attract morbid curiosity, there would be no such legacy for Gacy. He simply vanished. Yet, even in death, John Wayne Gacy remains a figure of fascination. His case is studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement as a chilling example of evil hidden in plain sight. A man who smiled in public, painted clown faces in prison, and destroyed over 30 lives in private. The final 24 hours of John Wayne. Gacy revealed little in the way of redemption. He faced his end with the same cold arrogance that defined his life, leaving behind a legacy of pain, unanswered questions, and one final, haunting smirk. The final moments of John Wayne Gacy's life were as disturbing as the legacy he left behind. With no apology and a defiant sneer, he went to his death without remorse, a chilling reminder that some individuals never confront the weight of their crimes. His last words, "Kiss my ass," echoed not just through the execution chamber, but across a nation still haunted by the brutality of his actions. For the families of the victims, there was a sense of closure. Yet no true peace can come from a loss so profound. Gacy's death did not erase the terror he inflicted, but it did mark the end of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. As we reflect on his final 24 hours, we're left to ask, can justice ever truly be served in cases like these? And what does it mean when a man shows no remorse, even at the very end,